you the outline that you have for today is part 7, but you should have part 6 from last week because we were right on the tail end of that discussion when we ended the class. So we want to go back, catch a little bit of part 6, wrap it up, and then move into part 7 of this amazing book that's called the Book of Revelations, right? No, what is it called? Revelation. Does that matter? Is it more than just grammatics? Yes. It tells us that it's one unveiling. The word revelation means unveiling. One unveiling of one person, Jesus. Not revelations. The reason why people call it revelations is because they're thinking of all the prophecies. Because the book is filled with prophecies. But you remember those prophecies are only events that fulfill the purpose for the book. The unveiling of Jesus Christ to the world. When the world sees Jesus for who He really is. Now, last week we saw that God has given us an outline for the book of Revelation that makes our study very simple. You'll find the outline in verse 19, where He tells John to write down the things which he had seen, the things which are, and the things which will be hereafter. And as that works out, the things that he had seen are in chapter 1. That's Jesus, the glorified Jesus. We called it what Jesus looked like at age 95, the human side of Jesus, the humanity. Things that are, that's chapters 2 and 3. That's the churches. That's what we're beginning now. We have wrapped up part 1 of the outline. And then by far the largest part of the outline is the things which shall be hereafter. After what? After the churches. Starts in chapter 4, goes all the way through to the end of Revelation, chapter 22, which again is obvious that that's the largest part of the book of Revelation. It's one of the reasons why I believe the majority of Revelation has not yet been fulfilled. We'll get into all of that as we move forward. So what is the part that is taken up by chapters 2 and 3, the things which are? Well, it's the churches. There are 7 churches in what we today call Turkey. When I was going to high school, we'd often call it Asia Minor. It's the Middle East. They operate in somewhat of a circle, starting at Ephesus, right down here in the lower left-hand corner, and then going up and around in that order: Smyrna, Pergamos or Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and then Laodicea. Laodicea is the church that most people recognize because it's the lukewarm church, and the message that Jesus gives them is probably the most dramatic. But those are the 7 churches, real churches. And yet we saw that these messages can be understood in 3 ways directly, right to the church. Doctrinally, what is there in the message to that church that would apply to all churches? And then these letters can be seen dispensationally. What does that mean? Prophetically. Do they represent something beyond the first century? And I believe the answer is yes, they do. They're real churches. They had real challenges, just like every church does. And that letter was to them. In the midst of their facing their challenges, doctrinal truths begin to surface. We can learn from their experience. But then their experience was also, I believe, prophetic. So how so? Well, I believe that the 7 churches of Revelation may very well give us a glance at the entire church age. Now, I've highlighted the word may because one can not be dogmatic about this. If you know someone who's a born-again believer, but they don't think the 7 churches are an overview of the church age, that's fine. They're still saved. Or you're still saved if you believe they do represent an overview. So I say may, and yet I want you to know I'm convinced they do. But this is one of those areas that we don't have to divide over, really. If you look at the chart that was on your outline or on screen, we begin with the ascension of Jesus right after the cross. And you have the 7 churches laid out in what I believe are not only the order in which they appear in the Revelation, but I think the order in which they appear in church history representatively. Now, don't misunderstand, all 7 of these churches existed in the first century. In fact, many of them did not survive past the 2nd or 3rd century. However, what they represent goes, I believe, well beyond that. And so notice that there are church ages in each one of these churches, and then eventually the whole thing makes up, if you'll notice in the very center, the church age. Now, we don't need to be confused about this because Jesus talked about there would be a time when the times of the Gentiles would be fulfilled. And he said that Jerusalem would be trampled on by Gentile, non-Jew powers until that time's over. It's one of the reasons why I'm a dispensationalist. I believe, not a sensationalist, but a dispensationalist. I believe that God works in different ways at different times or eras. Now, He never contradicts Himself. He never does anything against His character, so it's not like I'm suggesting God changes constantly. But the way He deals with different groups of people in different times may not always be the same. So here Jesus is talking about there's going to come a time when the times of the Gentiles is fulfilled. Paul also says the same thing. In Romans chapter 11, when he's talking about the future of Israel, he says Israel's going to be blind and kind of away from the Lord until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. The ESV, which is, I believe, a very good translation, the English Standard Version, words it, until the full number of the Gentiles has come in. So meaning when the church age is over, God's going to do something new. Now, it's not really brand new. God's been working on this all along. But God's going to go back to Israel and going to pull the veil off of them and give them the opportunity as a people group to come around to the truth. Now, Jesus says in Luke 21 that when all of this starts to happen, you're going to start seeing signs in the heavens. The sun and the moon and the stars, the earth and nations will be in anguish and perplexity, roaring and tossing of the sea. People are going to faint from terror, apprehensive of what is coming. Does that sound anything like the era in which we live? It does, doesn't it? So I would surmise, for many reasons, that we're probably nearing the end of the church age. But it's obvious that when this time comes, it's going to be an earth-shattering time. And when Paul in Romans 11 is talking about what happens to the Jews, he says in Romans 11, verse 26, so all Israel will be saved. Now, when he says all Israel, he doesn't mean every individual Jew. What he's talking about, that as a people, representative of God's chosen people, traced all the way back to Abraham, they're going to come to their Messiah. Out of Zion, the deliverer is going to come forth, and he's going to take ungodliness away from Jacob. Remember, Jacob's name was changed to Israel. So there's no way that you can read the church into this unless you want to do scriptural gymnastics, or what Hank Hanegraaff calls script torture. This is obviously about the descendants of Abraham, what we call Israel. And then he reminds us in verse 15 of Romans 11, if after their being cast away is reconciling of the world, and that's what's happened, the Jews were set aside, the church age began, it's primarily Gentile, and we've taken the gospel to the whole world, what will their acceptance be but life from the dead? So when Israel finally comes around after the times of the Gentiles is fulfilled, it's going to bring in the resurrection. It's going to bring in the final days on planet Earth, and then the Lord's going to return. And so that's what Paul is trying to tell us here. Now, if you want to write down Daniel chapter 9, verses 25 through 27, this is the passage that tells us all about how God's going to do that. Now, we're going to come back to this in a few weeks, and we'll look at this again. If you were with me in our study of the book of Daniel, we spent weeks on this passage of Scripture, because God revealed to Daniel that he had dedicated 490 years to Israel. And from the time that the command was given to rebuild Jerusalem during the Babylonian captivity, that's in Daniel's day, until the Messiah was cut off, would be 483 years, or 69 of those 70 weeks of years. But when Jesus was cut off, it's like God stopped the stopwatch with 7 years remaining out of the 490, or 1 week out of the 70 weeks. You say, well, what did he do once he paused the stopwatch? That's when the church age began. But as soon as the church age is over, I believe metaphorically, God will hit that stopwatch, and those final 7 years will begin to tick off of the clock. And he tells us that when that final 490th year is complete, righteousness will have returned to Israel, the Messiah will be on planet Earth, and the millennium begins. Now, that's a lot, and we'll go back to that, and we'll look through it again, but just look here, back to the chart. What you're seeing here is the book of Daniel. You've got the Messiah cut off right here. The stopwatch was stopped with 7 years left on it. Then you have an undetermined period of time, some believe right around 2,000 years, and then the times of the Gentiles will be fulfilled. And then what does God do? Rapture. And then what happens? He starts the watch again. And those final 7 years tick off in what is beyond the rapture there, and I'll have a great tribulation map for you later on as we get deeper into Revelation, and we'll break down how those 7 years, I believe, play out according to Scripture. So that's where we are, and that's why this is so important. So every one of these churches is a real church, but I think it represents a period in church history during the church age. And I'm not going to go through and recount all of these. That chart is on your outline there. But every one of these churches, notice, kind of falls into a date category. Now, I want to say very quickly, don't be too dogmatic about the dates. These are general dates. There is no biblical passage that says that the church of Smyrna represents the period in church history from 100 to about 300 A.D. I believe it does, but there's no verse that says that. You say, well, then why do you think it does? Well, we're about to begin to unravel all of that. Because as we begin to look at the 7 messages to these 7 churches, you're going to see how what's going on in those churches also corresponds to a period of time in the church age. And I think you're going to be amazed. If you've never seen this before, you're going to be amazed. So if we look at all of these, Ephesus represents the period of about 100, from the apostles all the way up to about 100 A.D. That's what we call the Church of the Apostles. Smyrna represents what goes on in the church age from about 100 to 300 A.D. Pergamos, 300 to 500. Thyatira, 500 to 1500. Sardis, 1500 to 1700. Philadelphia, 1700 to about 1900. And then, of course, Laodicea, 1900 to the present. You say, well, Dan, how do you get these years? Well, as I told you, it's not arbitrary, but it's also not dogmatic. But if you look at the message, and we will, to all of these churches, the message and the situation in those churches pretty much is representative of those periods of time in the experience of the church traveling through the church age. I'm hoping that I'm making that clear enough that it makes sense. Now, we'll come back to that. We're not going to race through it, but that is where we are. All right? So then that brings us to part 7 and your new outline for today, which is the church age. Now, for the next many weeks, and I have no idea how long, the title is going to always be of the lesson, The Church Age, dash, and it'll name a couple of churches. Because what we're going to try to do is break the church age down into these 7 churches, see what was going on there, what the Lord had to say to them, what does what He had to say to them apply to us some 2,000 years later, and then is what was happening then to them representative of what God was doing certain times within the church age. And I think the answer to all of that is going to be yes, and I think it'll be very useful. So let's begin by looking at church number one. Church number one is the church at Ephesus. We call that the church that lost its first love. Now, a while ago I said it's the church of the apostles because I believe it represents the period of time from the ascension of Jesus until the death of the apostles. So around 100 A.D. By 100 A.D., most of the apostles are gone. The last one is John. He's about 95 or so out on the island of Patmos, and he's aging out. We don't know exactly his age, so forgive me on the age number, but he's an old man, and he's going to age out. He's the last of the apostles to die. When he dies, the church of the apostles is gone. Just like in our history, when the framers died, the last ones basically were Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, who died on the same day 50 years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Isn't that amazing? Jefferson died first, Adams died last. They pretty much closed out the era of the framers. Some would call them founders. It's okay. But they pretty much closed that era out. And then you have the post-framer generation, which would be the children of the framers. So it's the same with the church. So what is Ephesus? Well, it's a real church. You can see pictures there of the church. It was founded by Priscilla and Aquila. You can read about that in Acts chapter 18. It was then joined by Apollos. Paul has a lot to say about Apollos. That's also found in Acts 18. Paul ministered at Ephesus for 3 years. You'll find that in Acts 20, verse 31. Timothy, the student of Paul, pastored there. 2 other students of Paul also pastored at Ephesus, Onesiphorus and Tychicus. Those 2 men also pastored there. You'll find those passages there on the outline where they were a part of the church of Ephesus. John, the apostle, pastored there and wrote his 3 epistles from there. Now, what are his 3 epistles? Well, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. And you say, well, you've got the book of John. Well, yeah, but that's the gospel account. The epistles, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John. And you say, well, he wrote the Revelation. Well, yeah, but that's not an epistle. So he wrote 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John from Ephesus. And then Paul accomplished a great deal in the city of Ephesus. So Ephesus and the church there was a key church in the early days of the church. So much so that Paul authored a letter to the Ephesians that is now a key book in our New Testament called the book of Ephesians. And there are great, wonderful, marvelous truths, like there are in every book of the Bible, found in the book of Ephesians. So it's obvious that the church at Ephesus would be a key church. Now, I find it kind of interesting that out of the 7 churches Jesus names, he doesn't mention the church in Jerusalem. I find that kind of odd, but the Lord knows the key churches that he needed to address, and so Ephesus is the key church to begin the discussion. Now, at Ephesus, you had the worship of the goddess Diana. She was a very immoral, well, she wasn't anything, but the worship of Diana was a very immoral practice. There's one of the statues of Diana. And you find that Paul's preaching in Ephesus caused a great riot to occur. You can read about that in Acts chapter 19. So there's no question that Ephesus made a major splash in the first century in God's dealing with the church. In fact, this is the amphitheater, quite likely, where the riot takes place in Ephesus, found in Acts chapter 19, verses 24 through 34. These are the remains of that great amphitheater in Ephesus. So, what is the message that we need to take out of this passage? Well, I think it's important that we read what the Lord has to say to the church at Ephesus, and then we break down this message. However, it is 10:45, and rather than get started with this and spend another 5 minutes, why don't we stop right there? I know we did not get very far into this new outline. I understand, but we thought we needed to do that update, so it took about 15 or 20 minutes to do that. So let's start right there next week. Let's read what Jesus had to say to the Christians at Ephesus, and then we'll break it down and we'll see how that might apply to us living in the 21st century, and how Ephesus is pretty representative of the apostolic church. Okay? All right, guys, thank you for being so attentive. Let's take a break there. Hold on to that outline, and we'll start there next time.